Hi, I'm Michelle Pegler from Gingy Makes Quilts, and today I'm going to share some tips with you for the new Sewcialites to Quilt Along by Fat Quarter Shop. Today's Monday, October 24th, 2022. This pattern for the first block came out on Fat Quarter Shop's blog on Friday last week, the 21st. This is not going to be a full walkthrough of the block. If you want that, you should check out Fat Quarter Shop. They put out a video on Friday where Kimberly showed the whole block start to finish. But I just have some tips for you from when I made it. I already made my main version of the 9-inch block, and I had some tips that made it easier for me. So I'm gonna make another version out of my scraps, and I will be able to share with you some tips around the cutting, the pressing, and the piecing of this block. So let's get started. The first tips I have for you on this block are around cutting. I've got two things that I changed from the original pattern that you might want to copy. One of them is for these main petals. I'm going to call these the petals of this kind of flower motif. The pattern has you do these in two separate pieces. So it would have you cut a square here, add the corner squares, and then have another square here where you've added this triangle onto this little bit. So I changed the pattern and made it a big rectangle instead for each one of these petals so that the fabric doesn't have to be cut and there's no seam on any of these now. So I'm gonna put it up on the screen. The cutting, you would need to do that for each size. And you can screenshot this if you need to. But basically for the 9-inch block, instead of cutting 4 2 3/4 inch squares of each fabric, you're just gonna cut 2 of the rectangles. So each rectangle would need to be 2 3/4 by 5. So you should have 2 of each fabric, or if you're doing all the same fabric, you would need 4 of them, of course, for the whole block. And then similarly, for the 6-inch block, you would want to cut 2" by 3.5 for those rectangles, and then the 3-inch block is going to be 1 1/4 by 2 inches. That's my first tip. And then my second tip, which is something that Kimberly did show on her live stream, is around strip piecing these little parts. So let me hold this up. You can see better, but this background actually is a different piece. So you essentially make this unit, and it says to do it, one at a time with a rectangle and a rectangle, but you can do all 4 at a time by strip piecing a long strip and then subcutting down into the squares that you need. So I'll give you the instructions for cutting on how to do that as well. This is going to replace pieces D and H from the pattern. So piece D comes from the background, whatever your background is, and then H is whatever fabric you're using for this pinwheel accent in the middle. And so you can see the instructions here. You would need to cut, if you're doing it all in one long strip, and you can take a screenshot of this if you need it for the different block sizes. My next tip about this block is around the piecing. This block has heavy use of corner squares, and I'll be honest, I do not like doing corner squares. It's probably my least favorite traditional piecing method, but this block uses a lot of them. So just as a reminder, we're making this block, you're gonna have to put corner squares on each one of these little corner units. Each one of these rectangle petals that we just talked about cutting differently, you've got a little corner square on the top left, top right, and then you're eventually going to have to put this on as a corner square as well after you strip pieced those units together. So a lot of corner squares. Use whatever corner square method you find works for you. I'll tell you what I do. So I used to use the diagonal seam tape, and I would put that on my machine, and it works great. The only thing I don't like about it is that whenever I would have to change my bobbin, I'd have to kind of peel the tape away and restick it, so it would come off a lot. I recently just decided to draw the lines on with a Sharpie permanent marker. I believe Jessica Dayon has a video that she has saved in her highlights on her Instagram page. If you want to go check that out to see how to do this, this is fantastic. It's built in now. And I do not draw a diagonal line on the corner square like the pattern would tell you to. I just use these lines on my machine. So, you know, this is one of my rectangles. It's going to be my petal. I'm going to have to add 2 corner squares to the top right, top left. And essentially I just make sure that my corner square is lined up with both those edges in the corner as best as possible. I put it right there on my needle. And then as I'm sewing it through, I'm watching this point right here. So all I'm doing is making sure that this point is following that middle line so that I'm going to get a really nice diagonal across. So it saves a lot of time in terms of not having to mark those center lines, and I get a really good result from that. The next tip I have for you is also regarding all the corner squares, because when you make a corner square, of course, you have to cut off the extra corners that aren't going to be part of the block before you press the seam open. So what I like to do is actually cut them all at once. So I've already stacked up a bunch here, but essentially I'm using the lines on my mat and laying down that seam line right along one of the grid lines and all the way down so that I can just stack these up, making sure it's matching on that seam line and still on this line. So I can stack up a bunch, bring my ruler over only one time, make sure I've got my 1/4 inch seam past that sewed line, and cut them all at the same time. So that just makes it a little bit faster. Now I'm going to press these and show you some tips there. At this point, I am ready to press my first set of blocks. What I didn't tell you yet is my stitch length. I'm using a pretty tight stitch length because I'm going to be pressing a lot open to make this block lay really flat. On my Singer machine, that means a 1.8 stitch length, but you know, do whatever's right for your machine, and you could go lower than that if you feel like the pressing open is making your blocks seem unstable. I pressed a lot open on my first version of this, and I mean, it's not at all gonna tug apart anywhere. Like, it feels very secure at the 1.8 stitch length. So given that, let me just first show you, for all these corner squares, I'm gonna be pressing these all open. For most diagonal seams I press open, and that's to avoid bulk in the final product. So again, you know, there are a lot of seams coming together here in the middle, and I got it pretty flat, and I got my points to match up, and that's because a lot of the time I'm pressing open on those seams. So pressing open, some people will tell you to first set your seam, then press to one side, and then turn it over and press open. I don't do that. That seems like a lot of wasted steps to me, and I also think it's harder. So I press that to one side and I press my seam together. When I come in here and I try and separate this out, I have to it's kind of finicky to get that open. Whereas if I just press open from the start, it's already kind of open and I can just start there. Like, I don't see any reason to set your seams, you know, pressing the seams together more and then pressing them to one side, when you can just easily flip any of these over and open up that seam right away. So whenever I'm pressing open, I just go straight to pressing open. I find it a lot faster and easier to do it that way. So, you know, press it open with your fingers a little bit and then press down. I do use steam to get it really flat. As we start building the block more and more, I'm gonna start using my clapper as well. Once we have seams coming together, I'll press it open and then set it under the clapper for a few seconds. I'm not gonna need to do that with all these initial seams because there's not gonna be a lot of resistance to going open. The other thing I wanted to share, so obviously all the corner squares are going open. This one that I pressed to one side, you can see you get the same result, whether you do the one side first or just go straight to pressing open. The other thing is on this strip piece unit, that's essentially gonna become that pinwheel in the middle. I'm also gonna press this open. It's really important when you have long strips that you make sure that your pressing doesn't warp the strip either direction. So what can happen is that if you do the normal set your seam, press to one side, your iron, especially on steam, it can warp and kind of make that start curving. And I do not want to do that to my long strip piece unit. So what I usually do when I'm doing strip piecing is, again, press open. And I just flip it to the back and press it open straight away. I do not press it to either side first because that, again, is going to warp it. So I just come across that whole line, straight across, press open, and now I have a nice straight strip that I can go subcut into my sizes that I need. And if you are doing this method and you're subcutting, just remember that you need 4 squares ultimately out of this. And so, you know, you can look at the pattern or you can just figure it out, because your strip now should be a certain width across, which right now it's perfect at 2 3/4. That's exactly what it should be. It should end up the same size as one of these corners that you just made. So I'm going to go along this strip. I'm going to, you know, cut, I'll start from one end, I'll cut a straight lined edge to start on, and then I'm going to go cut 4 squares out of it that match the same size as this, which is a 2 3/4 square for the 9-inch block. All right, so the next thing that you'll need to know if you're using this method where you combine the petals into a rectangle is that you have to do the block construction in a little bit of a different way. And so as you can see here, I've got my corner pieces laid out in the corners the way they're supposed to be for the pattern, right? And so to each one of those, I'm going to sew my background square. And so I've placed those where they're supposed to be so I don't mess this up. But for each one, I'm of course just gonna fold it right sides together, sew down that seam. And then in terms of the rectangle petals, I've only put on one of those little corner squares so far. So I'm now gonna have to add the other corner square, right? Kind of making a little flying geese unit here at the top almost. And then at the same time, in the same step, I can flip it around and add on my pinwheel that's going to go in the bottom. And so I've already figured out how to do this the right way, but I'll show you how I remembered it in my head. But of course, I'm going to be taking one of these strip piece units that I just cut apart. It's going to go right sides together. It's going to need to be at the bottom, and it's going to go with the larger rectangle on the bottom. So I'm going to set those together like that, and then sew my diagonal line this way. And then you'll see that when that gets folded open, that is going to look correct to the pattern. So just to double check, for instance, if we're looking at this piece right here, I'm going to end up with my background on the right side and my little accent gray pinwheel right there. So that's going to be perfect. So just remember that as you're laying these right sides together, you want the larger rectangle sitting on the bottom. All right, we're back to pressing. I went ahead and pressed all of these units open as well, just keep it flat. And now I, of course, trimmed off and pressed open these petal units. And this is where you're going to start having some seams running into each other. So, you know, don't worry about it. You got the seam coming in, but still I decided to press those all open, all these diagonal seams. So again, I just go straight to the open on the back. And since there are some more seams coming in, I have started using my clapper at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and get this one open too. Okay, I'm going to give that whole block a really nice press with steam, and then I'm going to quickly get my clapper on that one where it's got multiple seams coming in. And if you don't have a clapper like this, I can link to where I got this from, but if you don't have a real clapper, I've heard a small wooden cutting board can also work great, but you can see like that just turns out really flat after it sits under the clapper for, you know, 20 seconds. Here's my last one. To clapper that. So like I said, the block construction is a little bit different because we made these into rectangles. So I'm going to go ahead and lay out my pieces. There, here, here, and then my corner pieces are going to go around, right? So as you can see, I've only done two rounds at the sewing machine, and I've already got almost the whole block together. So at this point, what you'll do is assemble the quadrants. So for each quadrant, I'm gonna take the two pieces, fold them right sides together, and sew down that seam. And you know, technically these seams should match once you sew it, where with the 1/4 inch seam allowance, you know, this seam here should line up with this diagonal seam. But honestly, I wouldn't worry too much about it because it's all just background and it's gonna look good, even if it's 1/8 of an inch off, no big deal. So I will sew those together. My quadrants are sewn together. I pressed that seam open. Again, put it under the clapper to get it nice and flat. You can see that, you know, my intersections are pretty good here, but it's not exact and it's completely fine for me. You know, you could try and do a poke pin. You could pin that to try and get that to match up better, but I don't like pinning. It takes too long, so I don't do that. I mean, from here it's pretty straightforward, but we're just gonna sew, I'm gonna sew these top 2 together, sew these bottom 2 together, and then I'm actually going to press those to one side so that I can get a really nice pinwheel points all matching up here in the middle. After I sew these together, for instance, I'll press like this one to the right and this one down here to the left so that I can nest the seams on that last run and get a really nice intersection in the middle. And I will show you that in a minute. So like I said, I'm going to press these to one side and figure out which way it just kind of naturally wants to lay. It seems like it wants to lay pressed to that side. Yeah, that seems like more of a hurdle. So I'm gonna go ahead and press toward that side on both of these. Yep. So here I will set the seam and then open it up and press it toward that side. So if you have the petals alternating colors or alternating fabrics, like I'm doing here, they're alternating around, you will press toward the same one on each of these units. So you see how that works? So I'm pressing toward this darker teal one on each, but then when you flip this around, that means it's gonna be pressed opposite directions, which is exactly what you want to nest seams on this last run. So I probably will clapper these. Let me just press them one more time and put the clapper on them just to really make sure they're flat. I mean, they're already laying pretty flat, and again, that's because I've been pressing open up until this point. So I'm just gonna set those under the clapper and then get them orientated, right sides together, and sew that last seam, which I will press open, the final seam. So I've got my pieces here. Now again, you could go ahead and pin. You know, some people would pin here at the start, pin maybe here, pin again in the center to really make sure these points match up. I usually skip that step and just do it by eye. So what I'll do is I'll fold these right sides together. And what I like to do is, since I did iron them so you can nest the seams, I hold that seam together until it's almost to the needle. And my seam allowance here is pretty good, but right before I get to it, I will lift up the top one and kind of peek underneath to make sure that those points are going to be right on top of each other as they go through. So as I'm sewing through, when it gets to about here, I'm going to lift up, see my points I'm trying to match up, put one right on top of the other one. Again, make sure those seams are locked together and then follow it all the way through. Last couple tips here. I have gotten to that middle seam and I've paused. I've gone about through the first half of it. Usually what I'll do is I'll get to the seam, sew through a little bit of it, and especially for bulky seams like this, I actually lift up the presser foot and then I put this piece of scrap fabric that I have folded 4 or 8 times, so it's pretty thick. I actually put this behind the needle under the foot to help lift the foot up so you don't get it like kind of stuck, because sometimes at these bulky seams it can kind of go and really have trouble getting over that hump. So I help it along by putting this little spacer back here. So I'll put the needle back down, and then the other great thing about the fact that I pressed all these diagonal seams open is I can see exactly the point I'm trying to go through, because this seam here is pressed open. So I know that if I can go through the right point, I'm gonna have really nice pinwheel points in the middle of my block. So this is gonna be the hardest seam to sew on the whole block, because it is pretty bulky here in the middle. So I'm gonna take my fingers, peel this apart, because I am going to press this last seam open. Especially with the pinwheel, I don't want the bulk on one side or the other. I want it distributed across. So once I get that opened up, I come across with my iron and, you know, being careful not to flip the direction of any of the other seams on here. I'm gonna come across with my steam, presses all over, and then clapper there in the middle for maybe 10 seconds, and then we'll take a look at it. So this is what I have for you today. I hope some of those tips were helpful for you. I know a lot of people have been saying this block is too hard. So I hope that helps you make one that you are proud of. And I will be making more of these videos as we go through Sewcialites for this free sew along. Here's what we got in the end. And I think that pinwheel looks beautiful. So yeah, you can get a block that looks like this. Just follow these tips and I'll see you next time. Thank you.